Sage Duguay is a consultant for Fisher International, a business intelligence consulting firm that supports the global pulp and paper industry in strategic and operational practices. As a consultant for Fisher, she supports a broad range of industry clients, including pulp and paper producers, industry suppliers, investment firms, and other organizations and their intelligence needs. So you're relocating back to Maine after getting your degree from the University of Maine as a process engineer, and you have experience in the Androscoggin mill, so you are a Maine person in terms of your background, and we're just delighted to have you here, so welcome.
Well, I'm excited to be here, so thank you for that. If you give me just a second. Hello, thank you for joining me this afternoon. So my name is Sage Duguay. I originally went to the University of Maine for chemical engineering. I'm a graduate of the Pulp and Paper Foundation as well. And I started my career in pulp and paper in the Androscoggin mill. At that time it was Verso. And I've worked on a few of the paper machines in that mill and then in their pulp mill as well. So after graduating from the university, I had the opportunity to work for a major packaging producer out in Washington State. And so I worked for them in operations and engineering for a little while and got a firsthand look into what some of the conversion and investment conversations that are happening from printing and writing to containerboard and what that might look like. After that, I also had the opportunity to work for that same company in their box plant segment. So I've had the opportunity to work in the supply chain from really as chips come into the mill or logs for the mills that actually have their own shipping capacity to what does that look like going out to the end consumer and to those customers that are actually purchasing that end product. So today we're going to take a look at the pulp and paper industry and how has it been doing over the last few years and where do we expect it to go. So Fisher is a business intelligence and consulting company. We're also part of a 3-company network that really covers the supply chain there from forest value for forest to market. We do price indexing and forecasting and some traditional consulting. And Tecton Orbichem is our petrochemical intermediary company, and so that helps us when we work with paper mill suppliers and paper mill operations and sourcing some of their raw materials as well. Look at some of the types of companies that we work with. So we work with them in a variety of different ways. In the paper space, that looks like WestRock, International Paper, Metza Fiber, and Georgia Pacific. So some of the very, very large players in that space. Some of our topics for today are going to be containerboard and e-commerce, investment and conversion, what's going on in China, and then sustainability, which is the big buzzword in pulp and paper right now, and then more specifically, what does that mean for Maine? So if we look at the global pulp and paper industry, we can see that we're still seeing growth at a rate of about 2% year over year. And so that's a really positive story in different regions. If we're looking at that at a global scale, we're seeing that growth is largely driven by Asia Pacific and more specifically China within that region. And then we're also seeing large amounts of growth in other regions like Latin America. In North America, more specifically, the growth that we're exhibiting here is largely focused in the containerboard space, and we'll talk about what that means. If we look at the grades, so if we look at that line chart, you'll see that each of those lines represents a major grade in pulp and paper, and that top line and that lighter green, those are our packaging grades. So that's containerboard, that's carton board, and that's packaging papers. And that data from 2021 out to 2023 is the expected growth due to currently announced capacity by countries all over the world. So we expect that that's been a strong market and that will continue to be a strong market. Some other notable growth drivers globally are tissue and towel. So that is that darker blue that you see down towards the bottom. We're exhibiting a lot of growth in tissue and towel due to population increase. There's generally a correlation there in developed countries, and then as other countries are developing, we see even more rapid growth in those areas. So specifically right now, Asia Pacific is exhibiting a lot of growth in tissue and towel. We'll also see in that dark green line market pulp. So market pulp has been a trend recently. So as we continue as the paper industry continues to mature, we're actually seeing less virgin pulp mills. And so because of that, market pulp as a product is increasing on a global scale. So containerboard in North America is the largest driver of growth here. And we're seeing that that expansion is very rapid. We've been seeing growth in containerboard since 2013. And in 2021 alone, we're expecting to see about 5.5% of new capacity come online. And so that capacity that we're seeing come online can be, some of it's due to conversions. So paper machines that were previously making other grades that might be distressed, their profit margin might not be as high. And then it's also attributed to some of the greenfield capacity that's come online over the past couple of years. We did still see growth in 2020, even with the other economic downturn that we saw due to COVID-19. So this is also a trend that we're seeing globally. Specifically, China is exhibiting containerboard growth at a much quicker rate. And then we're also seeing a lot of investment in Latin America and containerboard growth. So in 2021 so far, we've seen 2 million tons of new containerboard capacity, and we're expecting around another 150,000 tons to come online before the end of the year. And then we expect to see, that would be in blue and announced, in 2022, about 750,000 tons, and then probably around 600,000 in 2023 as well. And so obviously there's some margin here. Some of those projects might be delayed. They could be canceled. They're dependent on financing. But typically, as we're tracking projects, these are investments that have been approved already by boards, and oftentimes machinery has also been ordered at this point. So when we want to really think about why this growth is important and why this growth is exciting, it's because typically when we look at demand for corrugated boxes, we think about that in terms of the demand growth less GDP growth. And so for normal years, non-recession years, we find that that correlates rather closely. So you'll see that it's rather tight. And if anything else, box demand typically lags GDP growth a little bit. So we actually saw in 2008, so you'll see that box demand actually lagged quite a bit from GDP growth. And so we expected to see the same thing in 2020 for a recession. But in fact, we actually saw the exact opposite. So we saw a significant amount of containerboard demand, even though we saw lagging GDP growth metrics. And so that really brings us to our next topic on e-commerce and how that saved corrugated and containerboard from the downturn that a lot of other grades saw during 2020. So if we look at 2019 as our base case, as our index year, we can see the impact that demand had. So that lighter blue top is e-commerce, and that's the demand for e-commerce. And then in dark green and light green, we see our durable and non-durable good demand. So typically, durable and non-durable goods make up around 85% of demand, and e-commerce is only around 15% of that portion. So what ended up happening, or what we're still seeing over the past year and a half, is that the demand for e-commerce has accelerated so quickly that not only was it able to offset the decline that we saw in durable and non-durable goods, but it also was able to surpass that. So we actually saw overall growth. And so what does this mean going forward? So is that growth sustainable? Is that something that's going to structurally change how we think about the containerboard industry in North America? And some of the questions that we like to ask ourselves and to think about are, how much penetration will e-retail sales reach? Is this a continuing trend, or is this something that consumers had defaulted to based off of the other options that they had during the pandemic? So your grocery pickup, it's easier to buy something from Amazon than it is to find it in the store due to stocking and supply chain issues. And is that something that we're going to continue to see? The other trend in containerboard is box intensity. And so as e-commerce packaging evolves, will we actually need less paper? So right now, when you order something from Amazon, typically you end up with the box in the box phenomenon. So your product comes in a box from wherever the local shipper is, and then it's also shipped in a larger Amazon box, and you probably have a few other different types of packaging materials in there. And so a lot of companies have, especially Amazon, have made pledges to reduce some of that box intensity over time. And some of those different ways to combat that might be ship in own container. So instead of having to put your box in another box, can you make the box for the packaging the actual final end-use product and ship it in that container? Right sizing is another one. So just because it's easier to grab a box that's 2 times the size of your product, if you implement different strategies within your operation, can they get closer to the actual size of the product so you don't have as much void space in your shipping? The other trend that we continue to see is lightweighting. So across the US and Europe, we're seeing trends in manufacturing containerboard products at a lighter weight while still reaching high performance targets. And sometimes those targets are not even high performance. They might actually just be lower targets as we identify different regional shipping trends. And so we're seeing that basis weights are continuing to drop. So the real question will be, when we think about this, is where will that meet? So as we continue to see this increased demand for e-commerce growth and the reduction in box intensity, where will that level out in containerboard production? And so this is obviously very important to this industry, and more specifically in the state as well, now that we have a foothold in containerboard too. And so if we continue with the same box intensity that we're seeing right now and the same e-commerce demand that we saw over 2020 and through the first half of 2021, we'll likely need an additional 1.5 million tons annually of what that number was already expected to be for an increase for e-commerce. And so we've also run some models as far as, if we can optimize the amount of containerboard used in those boxes, what might that look like? And so those are some of the options that you see there. So we've taken a look at that at a 1% optimization rate and up to 3%. And so if we assume that we can achieve 3%, which is some of the rumored metrics that some companies are considering, that would look like a difference of 1.5 million tons. So we know that other packaging too could be impacted as we see e-commerce trends, and some of that's also in cartonboard. So that would be the difference between retail ready. So that's your packaging that is point of sale and point of purchase. So it's designed to be graphically, you've got a nice display, you typically have logos, it's bright colors, it's eye-catching. It's really an extension of your marketing and advertising. And if the shopping in normal in-person stores continues to decrease, there's less need for packaging that looks like that. And there's more need for e-tail ready packaging. So packaging that not only is holding the product, but that you can ship it in as well. And so those are some of the trends that we could start to see in cartonboard. We'll also see merging of substrates. So now your customer experience is not always in the store. Your customer experience is sometimes in your customer's living room. And so how do you bring that customer experience that you normally get in the store when that person is opening your product at home? And so you'll see emerging of substrates from some of those more graphic grades that have higher print capabilities and the ability to replicate some of that advertising on the packaging that you'll see in products that you're bringing home. So next, we'll talk about investment and conversion. So this has been a trending topic over the past few years, and especially important within the state. So with COVID, we saw that as people began to transition from office work to home work, it was estimated that when you're working from home, you're using 4 times less printing and writing and office paper than you typically would if you were in person or if you were in school. And so this is attributed to a few different types of finished products within printing and writing. So whether that's your copy paper grades or other types of papers that you might need for contracts, for mailing, things like that, you're using 4 times less now with at home. And so obviously that's still yet to be decided as we see what the lasting impacts of work from home or hybrid work environments. But some of the trends that we've seen from different companies have been towards digital, even as far as contracts. So This is an example from DocuSign, so if anybody has used an electronic signature type application, DocuSign is one of the most popular ones, and they saw 49% growth in enterprise and commercial customers. And they've really been able to replace a lot of the traditional paper uses that you'd see in contracts. So for example, my husband and I actually have bought and sold 2 properties within the last 3 months when we moved from Washington and came back to Maine. And we handled almost all of that through DocuSign. So when we purchased our property, that was entirely through a cell phone, and we accepted a bid on the property that we were selling on a cell phone somewhere in South Dakota on our way back. And so what that's allowing people to do as well is be a lot more mobile. You're a lot less tied to a physical location. And so every reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. So because of that, because of the reducing trend in printing and writing, we've been seeing that decline year over year for quite a while now. That's not a new story, but that decline really picked up in 2020. And it's not all bad. We did see some positive announcements over the last year and a half, and those would be in the forms of conversions. So companies that are operating some of those lower cost, some of those more attractive mills in the printing and writing space have found that they also could invest a little bit more money than they were expecting to, but they might be able to break into a market that has higher margins and that has a better outlook. So Domtar is one, so they are currently in the middle of converting their Kingsport mill in Tennessee, and they're taking that from a printing and writing machine, and they're making that a liner board machine. We've also seen announcements from Packaging Corporation of America, so one of my former employers, and they're converting their second mill in the past 3 years, and their third in probably the past 5, over to containerboard from printing and writing. So we're seeing a considerable amount of capital investment in some of these printing and writing assets to make sure that they are sustainable assets in containerboard in the future. And so what does that mean for some of the other printing and writing mills, and how do we think about investment in conversion and some of the assets that could be stressed around North America? So right now we have approximately 65 different pulp integrated sites in North America, and so this means that they either have the ability to produce recycled pulp, so you can take in OCC and make pulp, or they're producing virgin pulp as well. And so out of those 65 assets, some of the questions that investors are asking are surrounding, what does their infrastructure look like? Do the mills that are currently operating or have previously operated these facilities, have they invested wisely and maintained their equipment? What does their infrastructure look like? Do they have water and waste treatment services? Do they have the ability to generate their own electricity? What's the cost of raw materials? That's a large one. What does their fiber basket look like, and who else are they competing with? And so these are all of the questions that investors ask as they're going through and analyzing what their options are across North America and how we might look at how they're positioned. So obviously the last 2 announcements that I showed are southern announcements, and that's something that they're attractive due to their fiber basket and a lot of their raw material costs as well. And so those are some things that we can think about, especially too as we look towards the Northeast or even in the Midwest in Michigan and Wisconsin, where we have some assets that might be a little bit more mature, and we might have some other headwinds in cost and potentially in environmental. And so typically we think about mills that have pulp assets as being good acquisition and conversion candidates. So that could also be something that's promising for the state too. When we think about that in containerboard and what that's done to the structure of that market over time, so if we take a look at this graph, so each of these bands of color represents a different company and their growth over time. So those 4 at the bottom that you see, those are our really, really large conglomerate companies: International Paper, Westrock, Georgia Pacific, PCA. And then you see that there's a lot of fragmentation in that upper top band. There's a lot of colors there. And so what that means is those are all the smaller players that have been able to grow their market share and really enter the containerboard space. And a lot of that's attributed to those larger companies that have had long footholds, being very disciplined in their operating strategies and how they've been able to continue to garner higher prices and create higher margins and make it an attractive market for some of those smaller independent players coming in. And so what's really interesting about this is that we've seen a 50% growth in some of that smaller player capacity, something that was not really an attractive market with attractive margins about 8 or 9, even 10 years ago. And so we think that this is something that we could be continuing to see. And because of that, we've seen a lot of announcements by private companies and by players that are traditionally smaller in the space. So Green Bay Packaging is one. They recently brought on a brand new greenfield facility that they actually built right next to their old facility. And their startup was earlier this year. Other announcements have included completely brand new companies. So that second announcement that you see there, Crossroads Paper, that's a private equity-based company that is looking to locate a mill in Salt Lake City, Utah. It would be an entirely greenfield startup, and they're projecting to make 100% recycled material. And then the last is Pratt Industries. So Pratt is a large, a growing containerboard company that's actually based out of, their ownership is based out of Australia, and they own quite a few assets in the United States. And they've also recently announced a very large greenfield mill. And so not only are we looking at conversion assets, we're also looking at big sums of capital being invested for these greenfield facilities in the United States. The other thing that is interesting to note about all three of these announcements, so these are all major announcements made by private companies. And that is something that we've been seeing as a trend for investing over the years. And so one of the most recent ones is Paper Excellence. They've acquired Domtar, and they're also looking at investing in a few other North American assets as well. And that's really highlighted a trend in private ownership in North America. So you can see here, the comparison here is from 2016 to today, and we can see that broken down by grade. And so as much as we've seen a lot of that investment change in containerboard over the years, it's still not quite to the level that we've seen from market pulp, printing and writing, and even specialties. And so as we're talking about foreign investment and private investment, so our next topic is China. So China continues to grow. Their pulp and paper industry continues to grow at a very rapid rate. And in 2020 alone, they saw a little over 8 million tons of capacity come online across all grades. And then they're actually also expecting to add another 10 million tons of capacity through the rest of this year, and then an additional 12.5 million tons of capacity next year. So those are very, very large amounts of investments going into China. And then they're also across a few different grades. So the largest one there in purple is containerboard, but we're also seeing big investments in tissue and towel, which is that lighter purple color, and then carton board as well in yellow. And so it's interesting to see some of this investment because at the same time, we also are seeing a change in OCC exports. So earlier this year, China began enforcing an RCP, a recovered paper band, imports. And so one of the largest importers, they're one of the largest importers of US OCC. And so we've seen that our exports for OCC have remained fairly flat quarter over quarter. And now they're going to other countries in Southeast Asia, but they're not going to China. And so what this means is that this is creating a little bit of a fiber scarcity problem in China. So if they're not taking in OCC, they have to be getting their fiber from somewhere. And those Southeast Asian countries that are now taking the OCC instead of China, they have to be able to have the assets to do something with it. And so what we're seeing is that we're seeing a lot of investment by Chinese paper manufacturers into Southeast Asia. And so a lot of what's been going on so far is they'll either invest in a market pulp facility or they'll invest in a containerboard facility. And they'll either export that market pulp or containerboard back into the country for converting. And that way they're kind of able to skirt some of these OCC bans that we're seeing. And so this is going to end up spurring a lot of growth in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand. And so those will be some of the larger growth countries that might not have been growing at the same rate, but it's largely due to Chinese investment. As far as alternative furnish sources, so if you can't make paper from OCC and you can't make paper from virgin wood because they don't have a fiber source, they're really scrambling for a lot of waste wood sources. And so we're seeing mechanical pulp lines go in, so those are Nine Dragons investments. And then we're also seeing other semi-chemical, mechanical fiber streams from Li and Man, which is another large Chinese paper manufacturer. And we're seeing an increasing amount of wood waste being used in the production of corrugated medium. And so this is, might be a short-term solution to their problem, but the issue is that over time, as you introduce more recycled furnish or more low-quality furnish into your containerboard streams, then the overall quality of your containerboard goes down. And the other trend that's going on in China right now, like everybody else, we're discussing carbon emissions. So China has released some targets for 2060. And so if we look at, so Fisher models carbon emissions by country and by mill and by every pulp and paper machine globally. And we can see that China and Asia Pacific largely, those are all the blue bars, and it's by company capacity. And Asia Pacific they're the higher emitters, and China by far as well. And so this is largely driven by their reliance on fossil fuels, and more specifically coal. And so in the pulp and paper industry, the difference between burning coal and natural gas burns about 50% cleaner from a carbon emission standpoint. And so as we look at some of these carbon taxes or carbon emissions discussions, that's going to be a large consideration. For scale, so North America is the larger bar in green that you see. And so considerably less than China, but there are still some other countries in Europe and Latin America that are faring better. And so this leads us into sustainability. So there are two main ways that we can think about sustainability that we'll talk about today. So one of them is from a carbon emission standpoint, and then the other is from packaging and plastics and single use, and what does that mean going forward. So sustainability isn't new. These are things that we were considering before COVID, but there's been a lot of increase in the demand for change. And so there was a survey done by global fund managers, and 71% of them believed that there would be further action to tackle climate change and biodiversity losses. And so an example of some of those major companies that have already come out with certain pledges, so Apple, Amazon, Unilever, Starbucks, and Nike. So a lot of these are either zero carbon or net zero carbon. Some of them are based off of operational changes that they'll make. Some of them are based off of the replacing different fuel sources. And then more specifically, some of them are also considering carbon offsets as well. And so as we think about carbon, it's not really a when or an if, or sorry, it's not really an if it's going to affect you, it's a when. And then, further down the line, it will be how much. So we know that the current administration is very interested in enacting limits for carbon emissions. And so the major question being discussed right now is what will that look like? And what does that mean for us? So we also know that the current Treasury Secretary favors a market-based mechanism and has discussed different ETS, so emissions trading systems. And so if that's the case, there are a few ways that we can think about that. So there are some voluntary markets that are currently exist in the US and in California. There's some that also have tried to various degrees in Europe as well. And what that means is that as a producer, you can produce carbon negative, you can make investments in carbon negative technology to offset your carbon production as well. And so one, that's a interesting dynamic for the pulp and paper industry that's being discussed is the purchase of forest lands. So making sure that we can continue to sequester carbon through the use of forests. So the main concern there is we only have about 2%, give or take, working forests across the U.S. So anyways, the exercise that we go through is if we look at the percentage of working forests that we have, what are some of the options for that carbon offset? So one of the things that we want to avoid is being able to purchase forest land that was always going to stay forest land. So forest land that was not intended to be harvested, that wasn't part of a working forest. And so the idea there is that we want to avoid additionality. So that's already providing a carbon sink. And so if a producer or any sort of manufacturer was able to purchase that land as far as their offsets, are they really actually doing any sort of incremental good because it was already going to be there? So some of the other ways that we can look at this as it pertains to the forest products industry are, do they have the ability to plant more trees? And then what is the rate of carbon offset there? And then the other would also be, can you purchase working forest land and prevent that from being harvested? And then the third would also be, is there a way to increase the efficiency of forests that are already working and already being harvested, so that way the operating quality is better? And so what this means for the pulp and paper industry is that as other manufacturers or as other companies are able to purchase that type of material, it could very likely drive up the price of raw materials for the pulp and paper industry to the point where they would not be able to be competitive in producing paper products and in being able to really procure the materials that they need to manufacture their product. And so those are some of the real concerns that we think about, and that's the thought exercise that we go through when we talk about carbon legislation. And then really regardless of how it's implemented, whether or not we look at a trading system or a credit system, or it's actually applied on a tax basis, it's not going to impact everybody equally. So this is a carbon emission curve. So this is a modeled carbon emissions for all North American containerboard producers. So within the same grade, so the idea is they should be, they should be a comparable data set. We see from the lower producers to the higher producers that there could be as much of a 4-time difference in carbon emissions. And so that could really start to impact the cost structure for a lot of these mills, and mills that were already on the edge of being cost competitive might really see a huge impact to their bottom line. And so we don't quite know yet who that's going to impact or how it will impact them, but the way that we can think about that, or the other ways that we can consider what that might look like, is when we think about shipping and freight costs and deliver cost. So here, this is a map of North America for all containerboard producers. So containerboard producers are in purple. They're the darker pins on that map. And then in yellow and orange, those are the corrugators. So that's your general regional distribution of producers versus consumers for containerboard. And what that might mean, if we look at this on a delivered base, you see there's a large step change. And this is in carbon emissions. And typically, what we're expecting is those facilities that are represented on the smaller part of that curve are going to be the producers that are much closer to Chicago or to wherever your intended destination is. And then that makes it not very competitive for anybody that's outside of that region. And so what that could do is that could create some very large regional shifts in how we look at producers and where they're delivering to in their intended markets. And so the last is when we talk about anti-plastic measures and then the difference between single-use plastics and eliminating single-use plastics. So right now there's a lot of legislation that has already been enacted in Europe. And so as this starts becoming a greater trend in the U.S. and in the state, we start to look towards countries that have already implemented some of these systems. So initially there was a study done in Europe. So basically around 25% of the plastic packaging that they consume already had a direct replacement with a fiber-based packaging. So it could be subbed out, pretty much one for one for a paper product. And so they found that that attributed to 4.5 million tons of packaging. And so that might be a study that we look at here as well. And the major trends that this was able to identify were that their largest opportunities were in bottles, so, you know, cartons that we have already. And then the others were tray and clamshells. So in food delivery products and molded fiber products and that type of finished product. And then there were some others as well. So bags and boxes were obviously high on that list, and we already have one-to-one substitutions for those. The European Union also implemented a single-use plastic tax, and that's also expected to further accelerate some of that growth into sustainable packaging measures as well. So already we've seen an initial increase of about 100 to 200 tons annually, tons per area, which is starting to grow. And we'll see the continued effects of that in the second half of the year. And so this is something that's really timely for the state of Maine when we recently enacted the single-use plastic ban. And you know, for some of you, I don't know, I have a hard time remembering my bags a lot of times. And so I have purchased a lot of paper bags over the last few months. And I'm sure that many others have as well. And so we also expect to see some of those markets change to address some of that demand. What could be concerning as we talk about banning single-use plastics is that there are certain environmental organizations globally and non-governmental organizations that are even looking towards the future, and instead of just eliminating single-use plastics, looking at single-use materials altogether. And so obviously that could be very problematic when we think about the packaging grades and we think about the growth that we're seeing in pulp and paper and where those grades are here in North America. And so those are things that are still yet to be seen as we go forward. A lot of these bills are still in their infancy, or if they've been implemented, it's been for a short enough time that we're not quite sure yet what the impacts are. And so what does this mean for Maine? So the major question is Maine's pulp and paper industry stabilizing? So if we look at a trend from 2007 out to what we expect capacity to be in 2022, we see a little bit of an interesting story. So on the one hand, we do see that overall capacity within the state is decreasing. Largely attributed to printing and writing. But the other story that's really interesting to see here is each of these color bands represents a major grade. And towards the end of that graph, you see a lot more colors being introduced. And so what this means is that Maine has started to diversify some of the reliance on printing and writing grades into some other products. So we still have a large foothold in printing and writing, and that's continuing to decline at about a rate of 1.4% year over year. And what we saw from 2019 to 2020 was rather steep, and we anticipate that leveling off for a little bit before continuing that decline, as you can see there in the expected numbers for 2022 and 2023. And so as we see some of that diversification in the grading structure, the question really becomes, where is that going? So in 2007, so the industry was 71% producing printing and writing off the assets that existed. Around 17% market pulp, and then specialties was the third highest grade. And so in 2021, although the overall industry has shrunk in the state, we have a lot more grades that are being produced, and we're also producing grades in segments that are growing and that are seeing higher margins. So printing and writing has dropped to only around 28%. Market pulp has increased to 24%, and then specialties have increased their foothold as well, followed by containerboard. So this is a positive story in the types of products that we're producing. And so some of the reasons why that is, so we've seen some trends. These are the average prices of market pulp by product in the US from 2017 to 2021. This is quarter over quarter. And so what we've seen here in the blue on top, that's kraft pulp. So that's the market pulp products that Maine produces here in some of our virgin paper mills. And so for the last 4 quarters, we've seen increasing prices, and that's a really strong segment. So largely because a lot of assets across the country and globally are actually shutting down different pulp mills. Specialties domestically and globally is a growing segment, and so particularly release paper, which is a very popular product that's manufactured here in the state. And so because we're seeing steady growth, or we are seeing steady growth in Asia, Europe, and North America as well, and we expect to see additional capacity come online in other places. And so that really helps reinforce the fact that specialties are a strong market segment for Maine to continue to be in. And so some of the takeaways and some of the things to think about moving forward are that we do have some positive trends that we're seeing, so diversification being one of them. Some of the highest growing segments in pulp and paper are segments that mills in Maine are in. And then the potential for investment as well. So when we looked at that map and looked at some of the potential assets for conversion or for investment, whether it's foreign or domestic, Maine's assets have a lot of the qualities that some of these investors look for, as far as, are they producing stressed assets or stress grades, and do they have the infrastructure needed to be able to produce some of these products? Because of the availability of raw materials, so because of the location to forests and the ability to bring in wood materials, it's also possible that they attract different bioproduct investments as well. So it becomes an attractive place for somebody that's looking for a large quantity of wood because they're not competing with a lot of other pulp mills. So typically when they're looking at investing in the South, the main concern is who else is in that fiber basket and who else is buying wood, so who would I have to compete with? And so that there's less competition here. So if their bioproduct can be manufactured from the type of wood species that we have here, it makes it an attractive investment. Some of the challenges that we'll see, so the impact of EPR legislation, so the extended producer responsibility impact could potentially be a challenge for producers that are already currently located here, and for investors that really look to the area as coming in. And so we don't quite know yet what the total impact of that will be, but when investors are looking at attractive mills to acquire or to convert, they're generally concerned with what is the local legislation, and how does that compare to other places that I might be looking at to invest. And with the putting more responsibility on producers of grades like containerboard and cartonboard that are produced in the state and that it would also be hit by some of this legislation, it could potentially impact how investors think about that. The other will be carbon legislation. So thinking about how some of those carbon taxes might be implemented, Maine generally is farther away from some of the markets that we're serving, and so that could definitely be a consideration as we move forward, and certainly as well in some of the trade exposed grades, so like cartonboard specifically. So those are some of the general takeaways from the pulp and paper industry, and does anybody have any questions? All right.
As the packaging markets continue to increase, which projects do you think are being more successful, virgin pulp conversions or the OCC recycle plants or some combination of those?
That's a great question. I don't know if we necessarily have a metric for success, but as far as trends, you're seeing a lot of the public companies that already own some of these stressed printing and writing grades. We're seeing them convert at a pretty high rate. And because a lot of these printing and writing grades already had virgin pulp mills, a lot of them are being retrofitted, or they're seeing increased investment to be able to supply the new different pulp qualities that they're expecting. Now, alternatively, they're also investing in recycled pulping manufacturing side by side. So similarly to what we see with ND paper and investing in OCC pulping. We've also seen companies that have, PCA for example, that have put quite a bit of investment into their pulp mills while also starting up different OCC processing. So a lot of it has been side by side. So it's been a combination of both. But a lot of the smaller companies that don't quite have the extended reach have shown more, trend more towards recycling, recycled fiber. And so it'll be interesting to see the impact moving forward. A lot of that is very new. Some of the capacity is just coming online now, and some of it's projected out. But those grades do have some different margins. So typically your virgin grades are better positioned for products that might be exported, or certainly your higher strength grades. So I think that it comes down to a lot of how the companies have positioned themselves to operate within their local markets. Yep. No, I think that I think that we've seen some, we've certainly seen some products. I'm not sure that any of them have quite hit industry scale yet. So one that comes to mind would be, I believe it's macrofibrillated cellulose through like Fiberlane. So it's an additive that they're adding onto the top coat of packaging grades to increase strength. But it also could be a wet end paper additive as well. And I don't think that those are being widely used enough to know yet. So I think a lot of those are still in pilot phases. So.
See, the movement towards being climate conscious, it's not like the land certification movement driven by environmentalists. Is this more corporate driven? Is there a group out there pushing corporate on Wall Street, or how do you push the story?
I think, I think the speculation right now is driven more by driven more by companies trying to understand what are their options for carbon offset, whether that's, really investing in forestry options, or is it investing in other renewable energy technologies, or other products like that. And so I don't think that it's necessarily environmentalist groups at this point. But I think it's just being considered as an option as they're looking at which directions could we go. So it'll be interesting to have this discussion in 5 years.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I think that they are definitely looking to import pulp, and so right now the question becomes, where can they get that from? And so that's driving them to invest in a lot of different areas that aren't China, that aren't affected by some of these recycled fiber bans. I also think too that as the discussion continues about carbon emissions, they'll probably do some of the same, just to potentially investing in a country that doesn't have a carbon emissions limitation might look like an option for them, so that way they can skirt some of that as well. So pulp right now, so they're currently importing, pulp from different areas in North America and Europe, and so I wouldn't expect that to decline, but I'm not sure quite yet if we know how that will structurally change from a virgin pulp capacity. Because a lot of the capacity that we've looked at today has been some of the recycled capacity as well. So not a clear answer, but they'll have, they'll certainly be looking to source virgin pulp materials too as their industry expands. We do, we do. So that does position us nicely. So ocean freight rate right now is the topic there, and we talk about exporting pulp. So.
Any other questions of Dave? Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.